In this video, I would like to present an argument against the veridicality of the Catholic Church from her teaching on slavery. That is to say, I would like to put forward an argument that concludes that the Catholic Church is not the one true church because she requires you, faithful Catholic, to believe two contradictory things about slavery at the same time. Okay, here is a brief sketch in syllogism form. Premise 1. If a church obligates her members to accept with full submission of intellect and will two contradictory propositions, then that church is not the one true church. Premise 2. The Catholic Church obligates her members to accept with full submission of intellect and will two contradictory propositions. Conclusion. The Catholic Church is not the one true church. I'm confident that this syllogism is valid and sound, but I think that I will need to spend a significant amount of time defending premise 2, that the Church obligates her members to believe with full submission of intellect and will two contradictory positions. These two contradictory positions are as follows. In an instruction of the Holy Office dated to June 20th, 1866, it is written that slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to natural or divine law, and there can be several just titles of slavery. And then 99 years later, in 1965, during Vatican II, in Gaudium et Spes, it is written that slavery is an infamy indeed. It poisons human society. It does more harm to those who practice it than to those who suffer from the injury. And slavery is a supreme dishonor to the Creator. Seemingly, the Church is claiming, at least authoritatively enough, that Catholics must submit their intellects and wills to slavery, being not at all contrary to divine law, but also a supreme dishonor to the Creator. This, to me, is enough to say that the Catholic Church is not the one true church. And I'll spend the rest of this video talking about those two sources. Let's jump into it. That quote that I mentioned earlier, slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to natural or divine law. That quote floats around in online discourse about slavery and the Catholic Church in pretty much every discussion ever had about slavery. I quoted that myself in a video that I made about slavery in the Catholic Church about 2 years ago. But there seems to be a great deal of confusion about the origin of this quote, and some Catholics even appear to be skeptical that it is even authentic, or that if it is authentic, that it really comes from the Holy Office, which is today known as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Here is an example of such skepticism. This comes from the Catholic World Report. This is an article written by a certain Jim Russell, and if you scroll to over this part, Jim Russell is talking about slavery in the Catholic Church, and he says that the history of the Catholic Church apparently includes an 1866 Holy Office text asserting that slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to natural or divine law. Apparently includes, though, has a hyperlink. When you click on the hyperlink, it brings you to a blog post titled Slavery Document 1866 Instruction of the Holy Office. The blog reads as follows. If you've been around apologetics much at all, you're probably familiar with the argument some dissidents and anti-Catholics like to throw out there, that the instruction of the Holy Office, supposedly signed by Pope Pius IX in June of 1866, I've searched long and hard for this actual document, and about the only thing I can find is quotes from dissidents and anti-Catholics, and not one single source with full context. It truly seems like one of those repeat a lie often enough and people will believe it, and you will even come to believe it yourself types of things. Why is it that it only turns up on anti-Catholic and dissident sites? Why can you not find the context anywhere? I'm open to discussing and even debating the topic, but let's have a valid source first, shall we? I challenge anyone to present the primary source document with context so we can do just that, discuss and debate this matter. I have to admit that I shared some of the same skepticism expressed by the Catholic World Report and that blog entry, I was having a hard time chasing down the source documents. But I noticed that the source was claimed to be reproduced in a 1996 book called The Popes and Slavery by a certain Father Joel Panzer. That book was out of print, and I looked for it for a while, and if you look right now on Amazon, this is all that you will see. There are no copies available in the United States. If you want to buy them used, there's 2 copies available worldwide, both in the UK, one for about 30 quid and one for about 60 quid. So if you want to buy your own copy, you better act fast and be okay with expensive shipping. Or you can just email me and I can help you out, either one. Anyway, I've read Father Panzer's book, and although it is slavery apologetics, it includes the entire 1866 instruction in Appendix C. Let's open up Father Panzer's book and read about this 1866 instruction. Okay, so I do own this physical book, but I scanned the entire thing just to make it easier for me to show everybody on camera what I'm reading. So on page 48, we have this section called Pius IX, Instruction of the Holy Office, number 1293, dated June 20th, 1866. I am going to read part of what Father Panzer wrote to give you some context about this 1866 instruction. Starting on page 49, Instruction 1293 of the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, June 20th, 1866, was written in response to a series of questions from the Reverend William Messiah, the Vicar Apostolic of the Gala tribe in Ethiopia. The instruction first describes the role of slavery in that culture of people, the condition of servitude, properly so called, among the Gala and Sidama, so strictly coheres with their social status that it is almost impossible to establish and maintain a home among them without the buying of slaves. Therefore, the slaves are held as a principal matter of commerce. In a certain degree, they have the value of money, and frequently, by the order of the leader or by prescript of their laws, creditors are held to accept them for the payment of debt. We see from this that the Holy Office was aware of how deeply ingrained slavery was in the customs and traditions of these tribes. It was not certain how Christians living among them should act in the midst of this kind of a society, and so they sought moral guidance from the Church. Today, we certainly know that the appropriate Christian response to any form of servitude should be, but life in Africa 130 years ago, keep in mind this was written 30 years ago, so this is 160 years ago now, it was rather different. Without condoning the practice of slavery in those communities, we can nevertheless view the response of the Holy Office, which follows, as a legitimate attempt to incorporate the long-standing teaching of the Church into the ancient culture of these peoples to whom the gospel message was being delivered. Okay, so that's the context. A bishop in Ethiopia is saying, hey, Vatican, I'm in this weird situation where I am in a society in which slavery is normal, but we have Christians living in this society. How should Christians go about the whole slavery topic? And this is how the Holy Office responds. Servitude itself, and we can go into Appendix C and read the original Latin. Most translations translate that word as slavery. So slavery itself, considered in itself and alone, per se at absolute, so slavery per se, is by no means repugnant to the natural or divine law, and there can be present very many just titles for servitude, as can be seen by consulting the approved theologians and interpreter of the canons. For the dominion which belongs to a master in respect to a slave is not to be understood as any other than the perpetual right of disposing to one's own advantage of servile work, which dominion it is legitimate for a person to offer to another person. From this it follows that it is not repugnant to the natural or divine law that a slave be bought, sold, exchanged, or given. And here's where Father Panzer more or less acknowledges that that word servitus does mean slavery. The instruction is clear that the word servitus encompasses forms of human labor that are both acceptable in the eyes of the Church and common in some parts of the world. Given that such just titles for servitude exist, there also exists the right of both the one freely offering himself in servitude to be the slave of another, and the right of the master to make use of that slave. From this, the instruction gives the conclusion that the buying and selling of this kind of slave is not opposed to either divine or natural law. The instruction is, of course, referring to a very specific type of servitude, namely, one in which dominion is offered by one person to another, or one which follows from the various just titles for servitude. If you stopped before "or one which follows from the various just titles of servitude," it would sound like Father Panzer is saying that the instruction is only talking about instances where slaves willingly enter into slavery. First of all, who willingly enters into slavery? Only somebody who is so desperate that they would die otherwise, right? So why is this okay? But that's not even the point, because Father Panzer adds, or which follows from one of these various just titles for slavery. Okay, so slavery is legitimate and it's totally fine as long as the person offers himself freely or there's a just title of slavery involved. What kinds of just titles exist for slavery? That's a question that Father actually answers earlier in this book, all the way back on page 3. Father says, all forms of servitude are certainly unacceptable to most people today, but this has not always been the case. Formerly, the rules of war in society were such that servitude was often imposed as a penalty on criminals and prisoners of war, and was even freely chosen by many workers for economic reasons. Children born of those held in servitude were also at times considered to be in the same state as that of their parents. These types of servitude were the most common among those generally considered to establish the so-called just titles of servitude. Okay, being born of slave parents makes you a slave, and that is a just title. I owned your mother. Your mother gave birth to you while I owned her. That means that I own you too. This is a just title of slavery. That means that when we go back to this part up here, where Father Panzer is talking about the various just titles of slavery, he says, well, this really only applies to people who gave themselves to slavery, right? The instruction is, of course, referring to a very specific type of servitude, namely one in which dominion is offered by one person to another, or one which follows from the various just titles of servitude. So yeah, don't worry. The instruction is only referring to two types of slavery. The type in which one person offers himself freely, and the other type in which that person is not offering himself freely. Duh! Of course it's talking about those, because that exhausts all of the various types of slavery. Father, I mean, come on. This is slavery apologetics. There are children being born into slavery, and you're just kind of trying to conveniently gloss over that fact that being born a slave is a just title of slavery. And okay. Anyway, I'm going to keep reading because the letter of this holy office continues from the above block quotation. As long as in this sale or buying or exchange or giving, the due conditions which those same approved authors widely follow and explain are properly observed. Among these conditions, of those which are to be especially looked at, are whether the slave who is put up for sale has been justly or unjustly deprived of his liberty, and that the seller does nothing by which the slave to be transferred to another possessor suffer any detriment to life, morals, or the Catholic faith. Therefore, Christians, about one whom is speaking in the first question, can licitly buy slaves, or to resolve a debt, or to receive them as a gift, as long as they are morally certain that those slaves were not taken from their legitimate master, or reduced to slavery unjustly. So what does this mean here? What does it mean to be reduced to slavery unjustly? It doesn't mean to be born into it, because that is a just title of servitude. Unjustly being reduced to slavery would be being a free man who, as an adult, is forced into slavery. That's unjust. But being born into it, well, that's just your lot. Also, you can't mistreat your slaves, so yay, I guess. But this is very clear, this 1866 instruction. Father Panzer goes on, this instruction is giving approval only to a very specific and justifiable form of servitude. Oh, let's keep reading. If the slaves who are offered for sale have been taken from their legitimate master, it is not permitted to buy them, because it is a crime to buy what belongs to another and has been taken, the master being unwilling, by theft. So see, this is actually totally fine, because the church is condemning stealing somebody else's slave. Oh my goodness, that makes it okay. This is slavery apologetics, is what this is. Father Panzer is a slavery apologist. It's frankly disgusting. This goes on. If, however, they have been unjustly reduced to slavery, then one must determine whether they are unwilling to be sold or given to Christians, or whether they consent to it. If they are unwilling, they can by no means be bought or received, since the captives themselves are masters of their own liberty, although it has been unjustly taken from them. Oh, so is this... actually, let me keep reading too, because if indeed after they have been fully taught that freedom belongs to them by right, and which they lose only by injury to others, they spontaneously and by their own free will as masters of themselves present themselves to Christians to be received by them and held in their servitude, in such circumstances it is permissible for Christians, especially when they act in favor of the faith, to purchase such captives for a just price, and to take and retain them in their servitude, as long as they are of the mind to treat them accordingly to the precepts of Christian charity, and take care of them to imbue with them the rudiments of the faith. So, if a slave was unjustly taken from their master, you can't buy them unless that slave is actually super thrilled that they got stolen from their old master because their old master was very cruel, and you, Mr. Christian, are going to be a much better master, and the slave wants you to buy him so that he won't get, returned to his former master. Then you can buy him, as long as you think to yourself that you're going to teach him about Catholicism. If you are going to buy him and treat him better and teach him about Catholicism, then that's a good enough reason for you to buy something that was stolen from somebody else. So the ends justify the means here. Anyway, we're not going to dwell on that at all. So the instruction here condemns the stealing, right? The legitimate master. And for those unjustly enslaved, the Holy Office teaches that what little freedom they still have must be preserved by allowing them to decide for themselves, right? Only those who freely give their consent may be purchased by a Christian. These distinctions have their foundation. Indeed, it was quoted almost verbatim from an earlier instruction from Pope Pius VI, given through the Holy Office over 100 years earlier. Okay. The next section concerns the second of two questions asked in the beginning. And so just as slaves can be licitly bought, so they can be licitly sold, but it is altogether necessary that the seller is the legitimate possessor of the slave and does nothing in the sale by which the life, morals, or Catholic faith of the slave would be harmed. So it is licit to sell a slave in any manner, therefore, it is licit to sell a slave or in any manner give the slave into ownership of any master who by a certain or probable judgment can be foreseen to treat the slave inhumanely or lead him to sin or abuse him for the sake of the other. For evil trade which must be condemned and strictly prohibited by the constitutions of the Roman pontiffs, especially by Pope Gregory XVI. So there's certain conditions where it's not okay to sell a slave. Sometimes you would have to keep them, like if the only other buyers are going to be non-Christians or something, then you've got to keep them. That's great. How does Father Panzer feel about all this? Father Panzer does not like much of the content in this Holy Office instruction. He finds it, in a certain sense, haunting, and indeed revolting, by today's standards of personal equality, liberty, and justice. Nevertheless, the real meaning of the document must not remain unchallenged in the hands of those who wish to construe its meaning to fit questionable conclusions. Like, the questionable conclusion that this is condoning the buying and selling of slaves, which it absolutely is. Without explaining the instruction away, we may rather look upon it as a legitimate attempt to address a complicated issue. Yes, it's very, very complicated as to whether or not it's okay to own people as property. Nothing immoral was given approbation by the Holy Office. Why? Because slavery per se is not immoral. That is the teaching of the Catholic Church. And Father Panzer is trying to explain this away. I think that I have said all that I need to say about Father Panzer at this point, at least regarding the 1866 instruction. What's interesting, though, is that I also picked up another book for today's video, a book written by another priest, but instead of Father Panzer back in 1996, this was written by Father Kellerman, a Jesuit, and this was written just 2 years ago, I want to say. 3 years ago, 2022. Okay. So this book is far more recent. And this book likewise addresses the 1866 instruction, but I think that it does so in such a way that is much more honest. Father Kellerman starts his section on the 271st page of the PDF that I own in 1866, however. And then Father Kellerman notes that this was 6 months after the U.S. amended its constitution to forbid slavery. So this Holy Office teaching came after the U.S. Civil War was over, or at least after the Constitution has been amended. Just keep that in mind, okay? So let that situate itself in history. So 6 months after the U.S. amended its constitution to forbid slavery, the Holy Office released what may have been Rome's strongest language in support of slaveholding since the 15th and 16th papal authorizations of Portuguese slave raiding. Messiah, I'm probably saying that wrong, the Bishop of Ethiopia, sent 40 questions to the Holy Office regarding aspects of missionary life and work. Several of that bishop's questions were about the moral permissibility of slaveholding. After proclaiming that the popes had left nothing unattempted to abolish slavery all over the world, the Holy Office wrote that slavery itself, slavery per se, is not at all contrary to natural or divine law, and that there can be several just titles of slavery. We've read this. Let's go over it. The Holy Office went on to answer other questions about slaveholding, such as confirming that people who had been unjustly enslaved but escaped from the missionaries could be sought out and forced to return to slavery, and that those escapees would owe reparations to their masters, and that even children born into slavery of the Christians who ran away from slavery but were not yet able to work might owe reparations to their masters as well. The Holy Office wrote that Christians could sell their slaves as long as those sales paid due attention to the preservation of the Catholic faith of the enslaved person, as long as the sale was not part of the African slave trade. The Holy Office also repeated its answer from 1776 regarding how a Christian could justly purchase an unjustly enslaved person. So, this is not looking great for the church's stance on slavery. The question of whether or not this was approved by Pope Paul VI is one that isn't super easy to answer. I don't think I've read anywhere that Paul VI absolutely did sign off on this. I'm sorry, Paul VI, Pius IX. But Father Panzer's article, it's called Pius IX, Instruction of the Holy Office. And then when you read Father Kellerman's book, it says, it is entirely possible that Pope Pius IX read the Holy Office's 14 pages of double-column Latin responses to Messiah's 40 questions, considered their responses, and approved them. It is also possible that the Holy Office briefed him on the contents accurately and he approved them. It is also possible that the Holy Office did not give him all the details, or that he simply trusted their judgments and did not hear much, if anything, about it at all. It's hard to imagine how Pius could have given 3 important Catholic abolitionists such high favor and praise while believing that they were so flagrantly promoting an erroneous doctrine, but stranger things have occurred in the history of the Catholic Church. So Father Kellerman here seems to be saying that Pope Pius IX did indeed approve of this 1866 Holy Office instruction. And if that is the case, then it seems pretty conclusive that the Catholic Church taught for over 1800 years that slavery per se is not at all immoral. I've spent a long time on this topic, and I am happy to get into specifics if you think that there's problems with how I've gone about this in the comments down below. But for now, I'm going to move on to pointing out, I think this will be a lot less controversial, where the Catholic Church has stopped teaching that slavery per se is actually totally chill. Here is Gaudium et Spes, which was promulgated in 1965. 1965 is exactly 99 years after 1866. So, in 1866, we learned that slavery per se is not contrary to natural or divine law. But then in 1965, 99 years later, we learn that there are things which insult human dignity. So whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their like are infamies indeed. So slavery, among other things, is an infamy indeed. Slavery, among other things, poisons human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than to those who suffer from the injury. Moreover, slavery, among other things, is a supreme dishonor to the Creator. We went in 99 years from slavery being not at all contrary to divine law to being a supreme dishonor to the Creator. The 1866 instruction of the Holy Office carries the weight of the DDF behind it, right? The Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. By and large, the DDF is considered to be infallible, at least in the practice of the ordinary magisterium. Maybe, I'm actually happy to say that, infallibility is off the table here, but it seems like Catholics they owe submission of their intellect and will to the pronouncements of the DDF, of the Holy Office. Catholics also owe the submission of their intellect and will to documents like Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II. Therefore, Catholics owe submission of their intellect and of their will to the idea that slavery is not at all contrary to divine law, and to the idea that slavery is a supreme dishonor to the Creator. How can both of those things be true? I don't think that they can. I think that the church has changed her mind on this, but has just never actually written documents that says, by the way, we were totally wrong for 1800 years about slavery. No. The church has never said that. The church never will say that. But until they do, it would seem that Catholics are bound to accept both. Any church that would obligate you to accept both cannot be the one true church. For this reason, the Catholic Church is not the one true church. Going back to Father Kellerman's book, it would seem that Father Kellerman mostly agrees with the point that I make here, that the church did indeed change her mind when it comes to slavery, that the church changes her mind on slavery, well, not on slavery, but the church changes her mind on matters of faith and morals occasionally, maybe not all the time, but occasionally. And if the church does change her mind on faith and morals, then what else could she change her mind about? That is the topic of the conclusion of Father Kellerman's book. So here's the conclusion, a theological reflection on history and reconciliation. Scrolling down a few pages, I would like to suggest, in light of the history presented in this book, that there are compelling reasons to consider the possibility of revising, even to the extent of reversing, a church teaching when, as with the case with the church's teaching on slavery, both of the following conditions occur. First, a number of our fellow Catholics are telling us that this teaching is theologically unsound, and two, a number of our fellow Catholics are telling us that this teaching is the cause of grave harm in their lives or the lives of others. So Father Kellerman is saying that the church has changed its mind on slavery, and that it's good that the church changed its mind on slavery. Then Father goes on to say the reservation of priestly ordination to males and the forbidding of sacramental same-sex marriages would surely meet these two conditions, and there may be other teachings that are candidates for revision as well. While changing who can be ordained or who can be married in the church might feel too massive of a shift even to consider, we must remember that it was also a massive shift for our church to reverse its position on whether it was permissible to auction off a baby, to buy children to send across the ocean, to live a life of forced labor, if they survived the journey, and knowingly sell human beings into lives which they would be exceptionally vulnerable to physical and sexual violence. When we read the stories of Pope Gregory the Great giving away a teenage slave boy and telling the new owner to do whatever you want with him, of Peter Claver directly participating in one of the most gravely evil commercial enterprises in modern history, or of slaveholders and public authority whipping slaves bloody or mutilating them for attempting to escape, we must resist the temptation to blame these actions only on the faults of the individual perpetrators. Catholic doctrine helped to facilitate these moments. Today, As the Church continues to fight against child abuse and human trafficking, we can praise and thank God for Leo XIII and his successors, so clearly bringing about a massive shift in what the Church had previously taught about slaveholding. The leadership of the Church of the late 19th century was open to doctrinal conversion regarding slavery, and this openness may very well have saved lives and prevented further slaveholding by Catholics. Embracing such an attitude of openness today will only be to the benefit of the spread of God's reign of love, truth, goodness, and justice, as long as such openness is rooted in prayer and discernment. As part of our Church's firm purpose of amendment, we must never shut the door on the possibility that Christ might once again be calling us, through the voices of his people, to further conversion, even one that involves a conversion of our teachings. Of course, there's plenty of Catholics who just double down and say that slavery is not intrinsically evil, but then they'll say that chattel slavery is, despite the fact that chattel slavery is literally just owning another person as property, and it's expressly allowed that you keep the children of your slaves. Like, how is that not owning them as a person? Regardless, a lot of Catholics just seem to double down, especially, I think, Twitter Catholics. They just double down and say that, yeah, slavery is fine, get over it. And I don't really have a whole lot to say to that, other than there's that famous Lincoln quote, if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. I'm not a moral realist, so I'm not trying to make a claim to any kind of ontological reality of a... But I just think that if Catholics were a little bit more honest about how they have to be on board with slavery not being intrinsically wrong, I think they would win a lot fewer converts, but at least they'd be honest. So, I mean, Catholics, don't let me tell you how to evangelize, but yeah, I think if I was getting involved in the Church for the first time, I'd want to know what they think about slavery, and that it's not intrinsically evil, and that there's really no way around that. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to bite the bullet on this one, I think you still have the problem of Vatican II, that you're intrinsically, or that you are, you still have to believe two different things at the same time, and I think that's a problem for the Catholic Church. But if you are just going to bite the bullet, then at least you're not admitting that the Church was wrong about faith and morals for 1,800 years, for more than 1,800 years. And that seems like it's probably easier, because you're biting a bullet either way. You're either biting the bullet and saying that, yeah, no, slavery is actually totally fine. It's not wrong. That's the first bullet. Or the second bullet is, yeah, slavery is wrong, and the Church was wrong about slavery not being wrong for 1,800 years. Both of those are bullets to bite. I think that the Catholic is just picking which bullet that they want to bite at this point. Okay, this video is long enough. I think I've said my piece. I'm looking forward to the discussion in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time.